All right, I thought about the best way to present the different forms of capital and to think about how these concepts or forms of capital can lead to school improvement efforts. And so it's helpful to think about human capital, social capital, and cultural capital in terms of straightforward definitions, some examples of how um, uh, these forms of capital play out in the classroom, how the culture of power draws on capital for some students but maybe not for others, how the culture of power can perpetuate um, uh, class differences, race differences, and so on. And finally, to start to brainstorm how these constructs can inform school improvement efforts. And so I've provided some in this video um, ideas for school improvement efforts, but I'm going to prod you to think of some as well, um, and we'll discuss them in class. So, first, some definitions. Uh, Basically, to think about human, social, and cultural capital, we can define them as what you know, who you know, and how you know. Human capital has been a huge push in the last 30 years to expand educational opportunities, to prepare the workforce with the competencies they'll need to be productive workers. They've mostly focused on literacy skills, numeracy skills, history content, technology skills, basically the competencies that are valued in the workplace. And these, by and large, have remained the same in the last, several decades, even generations. Even though the technologies rapidly change, schools are less quick to respond to those changes. Social capital refers to who we know, primarily our family relationships, but not just the networks that exist, whether they're kin networks or otherwise, but how the quality of those social relationships. So in the chapter you read by Coleman and Hoffer, they gave examples of the deterioration of social capital, not because necessarily families are divorcing at higher rates or that family relationships are severed, but because the quality of those relationships has diminished, especially in middle and upper middle class households. In other words, with busy routines of middle class families like we read in the Leroux piece, it's difficult for fathers and mothers to sit down with their children and give them the help they need with their homework so that the human capital of parents is distilled in informal settings to their children. So without a strong social capital, it's very difficult for human capital to be distributed across generations. Interestingly, poorer families, and especially immigrant families, have very strong social capital, strong family relationships, where there's a lot of time spent together, an important indicator of relationship quality. But the human capital of poor families, as traditionally defined, is low. And lastly, cultural capital is basically how we know. To illustrate this, I want to sort of go to the next page here and just start at the bottom. Cultural capital refers to the activities and routines in formal and informal settings. What are the rules for interacting, um, what's the type of discourse that's used at home versus in more formal settings. Um, so we already gave some examples of human capital, literacy, numeracy. Certain writing styles also indicate human capital. In U.S., the style of stating a thesis, including a body of evidence and a concluding statement, is the writing style of power. Um, but also speaking styles, linear styles of speaking are usually valued in American settings. Examples of social capital, as we mentioned, are not only our family relationships, the networks, and the quality of those relationships, but also our social relationships with neighbors. We talked a few weeks ago now about racial segregation in neighborhoods. And social capital is an excellent illustration of why neighborhood segregation matters. If what we know depends on who we know, then where we live greatly matters. Interestingly, social media like Facebook can alter these networks, but we've yet to see how those social networks can sort of enhance the human capital of children from poor families. Important for us as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the networks we have through church are also very important. As you read in Coleman and Hoffer, poor children in Catholic schools did quite well, better than poor children in other school types in their research. This is because the quality of social networks in those private Catholic schools were very rich and integrated across socioeconomic lines. Well, those networks can also be nurtured within our church congregations. However, often our congregations are drawn we segregate in terms of class as well, often in our church congregations, primarily because they're determined by where we live, geographic boundaries. But it's certainly a potential to build human capital of poor children. So now, how does the culture of power perpetuate class and racial differences? Well, in terms of human capital, it's clear that some things are more important to know than others, right? Not all pieces of information or types of information are important or are equally powerful. And so children from poor families often conclude that what I know from home is less valuable than what I know from school. What my parents know is less important than what my teacher knows. And so this sort of fissure between school and home becomes very apparent early on. In terms of social capital for children in poor homes, they can also conclude that their social networks don't matter. Kids whose parents are connected with the school tend to do better in school. This has been demonstrated over and again. The problem is that the parents who are more connected to the school tend already to be in power. And so this is another way to sort of exercise that power or even to strengthen that power. And finally, in terms of cultural capital, this perhaps is the most obvious, how well home and school values and beliefs connect matter. So often what's valued in poor households is not the same as what's valued in school. And so schools can sort of, as was mentioned in the Delpit reading, sort of tell the parents what they need to do, what they need to value. rather than try to assess what it is they already value to build on that. And so for a child in poverty, they learn quickly that they should be one way at home and another way at school. Well, knowing what we know about the importance of prior knowledge for subsequent learning, this can be deeply problematic and is another way that white privilege is perpetuated, another way that those in power stay in power. Well, rather than think about these constructs solely as a way to understand the problems, as was sort of articulated largely by Delpit, I'd like us to think about how we can draw on these three constructs, human capital, social capital, and cultural capital, as a way to improve schooling. And so I offer some ideas here, and I ask you to sort of think about this on your own, and we'll have some discussion in class. In terms of human capital, one way that schools can improve, drawing on this construct, is to expand the values or the competencies that are valued in school. So in addition to literacy, numeracy, and linear writing styles, we also need to incorporate the social competencies of poor children. These kids are in settings outside of school that require them to exercise collaboration, require them to exercise activity autonomy, require them to exercise negotiation skills. And so thinking about how to target these social competencies in classroom settings is a way to expand the human capital and to better integrate children from poor households. In terms of social capital, simply think of ways that you can connect with parents who have different backgrounds from your own. You're going to immediately be drawn to those parents who have similar backgrounds to you, and that's natural. It's uncomfortable and more difficult to connect meaningfully with parents who have different backgrounds from your own. Not only in terms of teacher-parent conferences, but perhaps more importantly, informal relationships. Finding ways for parents to volunteer in the classroom. Finding ways to incorporate what parents do for a living in the classroom. And then ultimately find ways to address how time and effort are spent outside of the classroom, so that the family relationships that are already there in poor children's households can be nurtured to develop human capital, the skills and competencies that matter in school. And finally, Delpit argued that acting like cultural rules don't matter, or pretending like we don't have a set of cultural rules, only perpetuates the culture of power. And so we have to make the cultural rules for schooling explicit for poor children and non-white children, while at the same time appreciating the differences. These differences include the types of language they use at home, their informal language, whether that's Spanish, whether that's African American vernacular English, whether that's an indigenous language, finding ways to appreciate those differences while at the same time teaching explicitly the rules that matter to schooling. Cultural practices shouldn't be an either-or position. As Delpit argued, this is a false dichotomy. And then finally, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So we have to be able to, as we learn the cultural rules of groups whose backgrounds are not our own, we can incorporate them and try to practice them in meaningful ways so that we value multiple styles.